Thank you very much. I'm trying to remember, Lou, when you first asked us to do this, it's been so long ago, you couldn't say, well, I'm busy that time, I'm busy next year, but I'm delighted to be here and to be with so many young people and to talk essentially about Florida and my experiences in it and to talk about the governmental process. One of my first ambitions in life was to be a fireman. And when I got over that at an earlier age, maybe 12 years old, I started giving out cards for a cousin that was running for office and sort of liked it. And so I went to school and designed my academic career based upon the possibility that I someday might be able to serve publicly. So I majored in public administration, minored in political science, and completed equivalent minors in business and sociology to try to prepare you. You really can't get too prepared to become governor. It just, the roof falls in on you and all of a sudden you realize you don't get any smarter. You just get an awful lot more responsibility and you're on your own to try to determine for sure exactly how to govern. I'm having a little coughing an allergy problem, so please excuse me if you would. I'm always delighted to be in the company of my successor, Bob Graham, whom you heard this morning, one of the most able people we've produced in our state and country. And Buddy McKay, one of the brightest guys ever to serve in the Florida legislature. And when I think of his cohort, Lawton Childs, I've known a lot of people throughout the country. I don't know that I've met anyone that was a finer public servant than Lawton Childs. I only wish he could be here. The next best thing, frankly, is Buddy McKay, because they had a remarkable servant of time, 8 years. And I listened to what Buddy said, what Lawton assigned him. The fact of the matter is, that might have been specific, but if you've ever seen a guy that was an assistant president, when the president was reigning or assistant governor, it was Buddy McKay. And having people like Buddy and Bob Graham in the legislature when I got elected, I was just fortunate. I mean, I started jumping out of airplanes when I was too young to know better, so you know a little bit of the story of why sometimes I've been what people call a risk taker. I've never looked upon it as risk. I simply didn't want it any other way, and if you don't want it any other way, then there isn't that much risk involved. And so I thought about the possibilities of running, not real seriously for a while, because no one had been elected from my part of the state in 100 years, and what Bob Graham will be the first to tell you, no one had been elected from Dade County ever. And so the first message I want to leave with you, young people, is that there are no insurmountable barriers to public office. There was at a time, but you can live anywhere in this state and you can have economic hurdles, they could be racial hurdles, they could be gender hurdles and all, but don't let anybody put hurdles in front of you. And don't underestimate your own self and your own development to one day serve. Thomas Jefferson once said, the nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects something that never was and never will be. Which means that you will be our leaders one day, and I'm not trying to be corny in saying that, but it's critical that the torch will be passed to you. And what Jefferson was saying is that we have to have educated people, because the uniqueness of our government, we were the first government created that was supposed to govern by the consent of the governed. A rather new concept at the time. And so how well we will exist as a state and nation depends a great deal upon those who follow us and the contribution they can make. And you can be the most sincere person in the world, but if you're not competent, you're going to have problems. So take advantage of every education that you can. Absorb it all. because you'll need it. My mother went to the 4th grade, my father to the 5th. I was the youngest of 6 children and from a very poor family. We say nowadays from a family of very modest means. And that's not a handicap if you're willing to work hard enough, and sometimes you have to have a few breaks along the way. And some of us have had them and some have not had them. But I had a hard time trying to decide whether to run for governor. I worried a lot about a deficit. Didn't have an awful lot of money. I was embarrassed when I had to file my financial report, which I thought was important as governor. I had attempted to try to get certain laws passed when I was a senator and wasn't that successful in that regard. And I remember one night, Donna Lou and I were going to sleep, and I was grumbling, and she said, "You know what your problem is, don't you?" And I said, What do you mean?" She said, "You've run out of excuses why you shouldn't run." So I've been frontally assaulted in a way that's never before, buddy. She said, "Pal, I mean, that's it." Now, Bob Graham probably told you that he was conceived during the political rallies of the season when his father was a distinguished state senator and running for governor. I didn't quite have the start you had, Bob, but I tried to catch up. But Donna Lou just said, "You ought to run." So we did. Now, the one thing that Bob and I had in common is that we were about 4% of the polls a year before we got elected. That's why we like runoffs. Leroy Collins wouldn't have been governor without a runoff. I wouldn't have been governor. He wouldn't have been governor. And Lawton Charles wouldn't have been governor. I wouldn't have been senator, I should say. So personally, I'd like to see him reinstated. I think every party should have the total strength of their party to present at the general election. I wasn't making a lot of great headway. My friend Lawton Charles was walking the state, wearing himself out, and it caught on. And someone persuaded me to consider advocating a corporate income tax, a tax that I had voted against as a state senator, legislatively. Ben Hill Griffin, a distinguished senator from Polk County, state senator, and I decided it was not constitutional, which later proved to be right. But I just didn't think that we needed it. But to show you how education affects a critical issue, we had an outstanding young man who later ran for governor, Steve Padgick, as a Democratic nominee to succeed Bob Graham when Bob got elected to the United States Senate. And at Princeton, they require an undergraduate thesis. And he wrote an undergraduate thesis on the case for a corporate income tax in Florida. And I had another young man help me named Greg Johnson. He wrote a master's thesis at the University of Florida on the economics of a corporate income tax. And as a senator, I realized all of a sudden that I had been depending upon the people we were going to tax to try to tell us what the facts were on whether we should tax. And we started discovering them for ourselves, and they came out different. Louis Delaporte, a great senator from Tampa, produced a white paper for the Senate Ways and Means Committee that made a case for it, and I couldn't believe what a strong case they made. And I was persuaded to advocate it. I remember Barbara Frey, who was a UPI bureau chief, and she said, "Well, Reubin, you didn't have much chance to begin with. Now you got none. Who ever heard of running on a tax?" And my position was, you're going to have increases in revenue one way or the other. Question, who's going to pay for them? And so I decided that I would advocate it. Well, I thought I was making some fairly decent speeches about it, and I was getting nowhere. But someone on my staff conceived the idea, several of them have taken credit for it, conceived the idea that why don't we make a comparison? So we bought a simple shirt, long sleeve, pink Oxford button-down shirt at Sears in Thomasville, Georgia, and one in Tallahassee. Well, it just so happened that both of them cost the same amount of money. Only in Thomasville, it was cheaper because they only had 3% sales tax. Florida, we had a 4%. The idea behind it was to show that almost everything that we buy is national pricing policies. And every time any state, and they had about 43 states had corporate income taxes. Personally, I called it a corporate profits tax. It sounded better with a message that had nothing to do with the personal income, and you'd only have to pay if, in fact, you made any profit. And so we bought these shirts, and the punchline was, it costs less than Georgia, costs more in Florida, but you know what Georgia pays, Sears pays Georgia to sell those shirts. And this, what was that? $500,000 a year. You know what they paid Florida? $2,000 a year. Because we had an antiquated capital stock tax, how you structured the capital stock in a corporation. And then we translated that into other things like smoking. And I could give you a whole hour lecture on not smoking. I'll pass on that for the day, but if you haven't, don't do it, and if you have, stop it. The biggest single thing that can wreck your health, just about, is smoking. But I said, all you people that are pack-a-day smokers, do you know that you pay the state of Florida 3 times more than the largest tobacco company doing business in Florida? And they said, that got their attention. I said, if you smoke a pack a day, and I hope you don't, you'll pay $56. And the biggest tobacco company, I don't remember which one it was, but they were making $30 million in Florida. And you know how much tax they were paying? $20. Because the capital stock tax is a minimum of 20 and maximum of 2,000. And before you knew it, I had people, I mean, they got excited, almost more than I could handle. Some of them, they got so mad. But the difference was education and research and the legislative branch having its own ability to determine what, in fact, the true facts are. And we passed it. It required a constitutional amendment, and we got just the number of votes for a constitutional amendment. We wanted to put it on a special election, which requires a 3/4 vote statutorily in Florida, and we needed 90 votes in the House, and we got 90 votes, and we passed it. And right now, it is still the biggest source of general revenue next to the sales tax that we have. And corporations didn't move out of Florida. They've moved into Florida. And so it's a matter sometime of, frankly, just taking a little risk and taking on a lot of people. And the three of us, Buddy and Bob and I, we've taken on our share over the years. I'd say Bob in particular, who did such a tremendous job in the United States Senate after doing a great job as governor. Personally, I would have liked to have seen him president of the United States. That didn't happen. But he also had the education that made the difference. So that's the story on the corporate income tax. When did we start? I often get inebriated with the exuberance of my own verbosity, and I'm trying to keep this title. What time did I start?
We don't know. We're worried about our own clocks up here.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you another area that was important to me, and that is the environment. And this isn't just praise Bob Graham today and Buddy McKay, but I got to give him credit. When I became governor, we had real problems with the environment, but my predecessor, Governor Kirk, who I hope will be showing up here later this afternoon, we hope he will, he was really the first governor that had a good environmental record. And he brought in a guy named Nathaniel Reed who was outstanding. And so every governor of every party, both parties, from Governor Kirk on, have had good records in the environment. But South Florida had a tremendous drought. And so I called a governor's conference in Bal Harbor. That's north of Miami Beach. I often would say Miami Beach, and Bal Harbor got mad, so I want to give them credit. Bal Harbor, in the fall of 1971, my first year, because government rarely has the people in-house who have answers to problems. But governors have the responsibility to bring together the people who know something about an issue and then sort of forge consensus. Well, he's here. I know he wants me to clap for him. That's Governor Kirk. Let's give him a hand. Governor Kirk, I was just telling that you were the first real environmental governor, and bringing in Nathaniel Reed, and I'm sure he'll have his last say-so. I always get nervous when he speaks last. But at any rate, and out of that conference, we got around 150 people. Now, Bob was there, buddy. I don't know whether you attended that conference or not, but you should have if you didn't. And I told them, take off the gloves. Don't scream at each other. And when I told them to take off the gloves, we had almost 2 altercations the first day, because there were people who felt strongly about it, of what to do. And I said also, unless you stay the full 2 days and 2.5 days, you can't vote on the final report. And so the attendance was good up until the end. And out of this conference, and then he really knocked heads, came recommendations. First of all, that we needed some type of comprehensive approach to growth management and the water situation. And out of that came a follow-up committee, blended some of the work that another outstanding legislator, Richard Pettigrew, who's one of the finest presiding officers any chamber has had in Florida in modern times. And they'd done some work, so we put it all together. And out of that conference and otherwise, and the follow-up work, we produced 4 pieces of legislation in 1972. The first was the Environmental Land and Water Management Act, which I believe is probably the single most important piece of legislation that was passed during the time I was in state government, which was 20 years. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm reassured that somebody even joined you in the applause. I want you to know I appreciate it. You did it just like I asked you to do it, and I appreciate it. But at any rate, the Environmental Land and Water Management Act, and what we're trying to do, we had an instance where we were about to build a subdivision on the water recharge area in one county, affecting the other county. So one county was going to build this big subdivision, I think it was Lake County, over the recharge area, their recharge area, and in Seminole County. And so we developed a regional impact, which required that if it's the big one that affects more than one county or affects so many people, you have to have some planning and some type of process. And there are also areas of critical state concern, which said that we're losing so many key environmental places in the state. What we've got to do is that we've got to protect them, and if the local governments hadn't been responding, we then apply a state standard that sort of forces local government really into a relationship. Out of that came these processes. And they were important. I got sued as a result of it because they said the court said it's unconstitutional delegation of authority. So when I left it in Bob Graham's lap, but then Bob Graham is most of his program anyway. So that when I claim credit for a lot of the environmental stuff, I really do have to give people like Bob and Buddy, and in particular Richard Pettigrew, credit for passing it. I want to tell you another story about Bob Graham. I have never seen a major piece of legislation where a person passed it in both houses. He was in charge of it in the Senate in the legislation, Environmental Land and Water Management Act, and thanks to my Lieutenant Governor Jim Williams at the time, who also was one of the finest people ever to serve in public service, they worked out a compromise. He passed it. Marshall Harris also, a bright guy and Buddy McKay's level of intellect, and I watched him try to explain it, but he couldn't handle the questions. And I'm sure you remember this, Bob, I saw Bob Graham sit beside on the floor of the House, the brain of the House, telling him how he answered the questions on that legislation. But we passed it. We also passed legislation, the Water Resources Act, which is the second piece of legislation that took 2 water management districts and made 5 throughout the whole state. And not only that, the boundaries weren't political, they were based on hydrology and watershed, and it worked. We then passed the Land Conservation Act, which allowed a $200 million environmental bond to issue, that as governor I'd been advised not to do because the previous governor got into trouble in a road bond issue, but I was confident that they would pass it. $40 million that we did on the recreation. We doubled the park system and started a land development program that up until this day, every governor's built on it, to this day is the largest purchasing of environmentally endangered lands of any place in the world. We're bigger than the federal government, $300 million a year. Florida forever. And then the last piece of legislation was a State Comprehensive Planning Act. The point I want to make to you, however, is that by forcing the people who knew about it into some type of consensus so we wouldn't select a process that was not thought through was the key to it, plus having key people, really helping you. We did something, I think, major in the field of education. We changed the whole way that we compute distribution of state money for education. We still use it today. Another area that I was most concerned with was in judicial reform. I spent more time on trying to reform the judicial branch of any item in the state. And so we finally got that accomplished, and just a little side story on it. 1972, when we were taking up, we passed the new Constitution in 1968. Unfortunately, I teach a class. I'm a teacher. I've taught here at UCF and the other 9 major universities in the state. I know that many times students are not given the privilege of hearing from people who have been practitioners, and so that's one of the reasons why I think that we enjoy coming here today. But we did revise the whole court system, and just one story with it, and that is that we were having problems, and Sandy Dallenberg, president of Florida State University, was having trouble with one senator, Dempsey Barron, in the Senate, who is a strong leader. We often were known to disagree somewhat, which is probably the understatement of the day. And I invited Dempsey out to the mansion. Donald invited him and his wife out to the mansion, and I wanted to get him to go ahead and get back on track and pass it, and he did. When someone asked him about how it was to be a guest, he said he wasn't a guest, he was a captive. We didn't serve any alcohol in the mansion. He said the only way he could get out to get a drink was to agree to serve and get this thing to the Senate, which he did. Now, those are just some items which affected me during the administration, and as I say, I enjoy talking and have now talked too long. I look forward to any questions you have later. Thank you.
I'm glad for the opportunity to be here. This is a historic occasion to have so many different governors of different political persuasions all under the same room. It reminds me of a story about Governor Askew when he found himself at a certain event where Richard Nixon was speaking and George Wallace, who was very hard of hearing, was sitting next to Governor Askew. Every so often, George Wallace would lean over to Governor Askew and say, "What did he say? What did he say?" And the governor would have to repeat it to Wallace. And this went on for the whole event. And then afterwards, Governor Askew remarked, "Here I am, probably the only person in the world who's ever had to try to explain Richard Nixon to George Wallace." Our governor was also very, very, very frugal with the public dollars, not just in simply not serving alcohol at the mansion, which was a matter of personal policy. He also, when he went to Japan on a trade mission, he was famous for taking along his own instant grits. But he was so tight with the taxpayer's dollar that his budget office was sometimes referred to, never in his presence, as the fiscal fascists. However, he was representative of something that we in the media have come nostalgically to call the golden age of Florida. Governor Graham was a part of it, and the golden age began to peter out about that time because of a rise of two things that happened subsequently that did not prevail in his time. The tax reform he talked about, which was the only one of only two times in Florida's history that the tax code has ever deliberately been made more progressive and less regressive, came about because it was possible to elect a man on a radical platform like that, and it was possible to have the two parties in the legislature come together. We did not have the poisonous partisan politics then that we have now. Also, a phenomenon that governed his election and made it possible was the fact that that was the last election in Florida, the last election of a new governor, which was run under the influence of spending limits. Now, that probably had as much as anything to do with a man who's not here and who wanted to be governor himself. Jack Eckerd, the man who had founded Eckerd Drugstores, was running for governor on the Republican ticket that year, and after he'd already spent $1 million, a huge sum for the time, prior to qualifying, the legislature was persuaded to adopt campaign spending ceilings, and Governor Kirk, who was Jack Eckerd's immediate opponent, was persuaded to sign the bill, and everybody ran on more or less equal terms after that. 1976, the Supreme Court of the United States said you can't have outright spending limits. That decision has probably done nearly as much damage to the United States as the Dred Scott decision did a century before. But Governor Askew has well covered. His administration stands remembered and for several historic accomplishments. Certainly tax reform was one. Bringing a spirit of ethics in government and financial disclosure was another. Contributing, enlarging on the work of environmental conservation and protection was another. And perhaps most important was what has been described by an admiring Republican observer as the single most unselfish act any governor ever did. And that was to give away his own power to pick whomever he wanted to serve on the courts. He did this by executive order upon becoming governor and had it written into the Constitution 2 years later, which was to provide that for every vacancy during the term of a judicial office and later, for every vacancy, whatever the cause on the appellate courts, there would be a merit selection process consisting of nominations from a committee that he could not nominate. He would appoint only 3 members of each nominating commission. The Florida Bar would appoint 3, and those 6 people would then pick another 3 members, the tiebreakers, as it were. We got some very good judicial appointments out of that. Now, it is a matter of record that a legislature that did not want to think for itself allowed the present governor to talk them into changing that so that the governor now picks all 9 members of these nominating commissions. This is unfortunate in my regard. I have referred to them in print as little more than patronage committees for the governor, and I do hope that one consequence of the next change in administration will be that we revert to the system that Governor Askew instituted. We learn from history what we could not learn at the time, and it's always easy to go back in history. And Governor Askew did not mention his singular achievement in 1978 at defeating the first run at casino gambling that came in this state. I share his opinion that casino gambling is a bad business for any state, for any civic society. But one lamentable effect of that campaign was, with so much attention focused on generating a huge no vote against that, and with so much controversy over an extreme version of a constitutional revision that it would have abolished the cabinet, every revision proposed that year went down to defeat. Among them was an amendment that would have provided for an independent redistricting commission. Does that sound familiar? We're still fighting that fight. That was 1978. We're still fighting it. This is 2006, and we're getting nowhere fast. Another failure that came very close, within 30 or 40,000 votes, was an amendment that would have required for the merit selection of all judges No more judges hustling campaign contributions and to run 30-second spots, getting their pretty faces on the court. We lost that. I hope the time will come when these things come again, but if when they do, remember who started them. The governor you just heard, and I will sit down now and give him time to answer your questions. If you could have done anything, if you could go back and redo anything you did or didn't do, what would it be with the hindsight of history?
Well, I would constitutionalize the judicial nominating commissions to begin with and put them in the Constitution so they couldn't be changed as they were.
I'll ask one. One of those unconventional defiances that we talked about earlier that I forgot to mention was your role in the Sunshine Law. Would you explain that? Because I think that's one of the most significant things.
Well, we had some problems in Tallahassee. At the time, we had 6 elected cabinet members that serve in various capacities, plus they serve almost like a city commission on certain collegial responsibilities. 3 of them we were investigating, and 3 members of the Supreme Court, actually 4, but 3 were seriously being investigated, and as a result of some impeachment and some work by the Judicial Qualifications Commission, we replaced 3 of the elected cabinet members and then 3 of the Supreme Court justices. I had wanted, when I was a candidate, legislation requiring everyone to list all of their assets by category, broad categories, and their sources of income, so that people would know what their net worth and their source of income were, so the press could, every year when they publish them, determine to what extent a person had substantially increased their net worth and how. If a person did it without a question, they could explain it easily. Otherwise, they couldn't. The legislature 3 times refused, when I became governor, to pass such a law, and then I took it upon myself to initiate a constitutional amendment. Now, Senator Graham did the same thing on the Board of Governors, which I congratulate him for, and it looks like now that for the first time maybe it'll be shown that they do have tremendous power, and it'll be clarified. Unfortunately, it's probably going to take the courts basically to do that.
We have some questions over here.
Okay, I got you. I'm trying to finish your story, but I'll wind it up. But at any rate, they didn't do it. I took it to the people. The people passed it overwhelmingly, and now it's part of the Constitution. One other part of it's important, and that is it stopped the revolving door among legislators getting out one day and lobbying the next. It requires a 2-year hiatus period, and the legislators took me to the Supreme Court of the United States, but they lost. Got a question?
What is your opinion on the A++ plan about taking away the fine arts classes?
I don't think it's a good idea.
Thank you.
What do you think was your hardest obstacle, like being a governor? Like, what was your hardest obstacle?
I expect dealing with the legislature from time to time, but there were exceptions to that. But a governor has to be very patient and realize that legislators are elected independently, and even though you might like to feel like everything you got elected on were mandates, the legislature doesn't always do it. But our system is designed of checks and balances so that if the legislature doesn't respond, that's fine. If they respond too quickly, then usually something's going wrong.
I got 2 questions for you. What do you teach at the university? And what is the...
What do I teach? Government and ethics.
And what was the most memorable thing that happened while you were governor?
Well, I think the most memorable thing is the day that I was able to appoint the first African-American Chief Justice of the state since Reconstruction. And when we announced it, all I could think about, was my mother who had worked hard to try to raise 6 children, and his mother had helped raise him. And I think I enjoyed that as much as anything. I might pass on to you now this justice who he was with Dr. Martin Luther King at the weigh-in in St. Augustine, and many of us older with white hair remember. And he was a young lawyer, civil rights lawyer at that time. When I appointed him to the Supreme Court, President Carter appointed him to the federal bench, and he wound up being the top judicial federal officer in the southeastern United States. And so if people say that we're not making progress, they need to just look at the history. But that's what I enjoyed the most, I believe.
What do you think about term limits?
They're terrible. So unlike Buddy, I opposed them from the very beginning. I tell you, it's how it was worded. If term limits had been put on the ballot and said, are you in favor of limiting your own ability in the selection, whoever you want to represent you, in favor of building a stronger authority for the bureaucratic staff, which is the legislature, people wouldn't have voted for it. The problem is that the legislature deals with so many difficult issues. Being in the legislature and Congress is a tough, tough job. You deal with so many specifics, and people need to stay there long enough to be able to match the lobbyists, getting paid a lot more and have more time to do it. So I really think term limits is a bad thing, and the only way basically it's going to come about any change is for those in now that are approaching the limit. They want to extend it from 8 to 12 years, and I think that's a good idea, but I thought it was a wrong idea from the very beginning.
What one piece of advice would you give to young people today if they were preparing to enter a career in civil service?
Get all the education you can and take it seriously, and whatever you do, realize that the people can hope that civil servants are competent. They got a right to demand honesty, and to remember from the very beginning, the key thing on public service, as most pursuits in life, is integrity.
I was just wondering if you are concerned with the lack of interest and involvement young people have in politics today, and if so, what do you think can be done to involve them more?
I think that what y'all are doing right now is the best possible thing, thanks to Lou, that you can do to try to encourage yourself and to understand the role that you have to play. You remember who Benjamin Franklin was? Benjamin Franklin, a great, great man, and when he left the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, someone asked him, what have you given us? And he said, a republic, sir, if we can keep it. And our country will only be perpetuated in strength to the extent that young people develop their minds and make sure that whatever they do, they're being honest about doing it, and then get all the education that you can.
I want to go to law school next year, so
Law school?
Yeah, healthcare
Yes.
law. My question is, if you could explain how you, on the homestead exemption, explain a little bit on how you helped us with that, because that's a tremendous help to me.
Well, we increased the homestead exemption from 5 to 10,000, and then during Governor Graham's term, it was increased to 25,000. Homestead exemption is a wonderful thing to promote home ownership, but bear in mind, financing public schools relies substantially upon local property tax. And what you have, you've got to make sure that you have a fair assessment level. If the assessment level drops too far and you have this big exemption, the schools are not going to get all that they need to operate on. So it helps home ownership. At the same time, I think there is a responsibility to ensure that your homes are accurately assessed so that it's done the right proportions.
I have another question. Can you tell me two of your mentors and why they made an impact on you as a, in your career?
Well, first of all, the person who had the greatest impact on my wife, two people, and that's my mother and my wife. I'll start with that, you know, and but the people themselves were Roy Collins, who was probably as fine a governor as any state has ever had any time in modern times in the United States. He had an impact upon me, and he was sort of a mentor, and I got him to know early. I got helping him politically even as a student at Florida State University. And Senator Claude Pepper, who was also a great guy, that was a tremendous guy in the area of civil rights in particular. And what I liked about both of them, at the height of their career, they remained humble people and really were for people, and they never let the special interests get the best of them.
Well, Governor's question I always want to ask you. You were wildly popular. Kennedy School named you one of the top 10 governors in 20th century, and
well, that was a nice study done at the Kennedy School. But I must tell you, in fairness to Bob Graham, that I was at That was done when I was governor, and he never even qualified and had a chance at it. But it meant a lot to me, because I know the guy who did the study, you know, but you leave it to history as to how you're judged. Each governor is judged by history. Sometimes you can be quickly judged, and sometimes it takes a long time to be judged. But no, I was pleased with any politician who says they weren't pleased at a compliment or fib about other things.
The question I had for you is, why didn't you run for the Senate?
Well, a lot of reasons, but first of all, I thought I'd made a mistake in getting in it. And second, the money situation was so bad that the only time I saw people was with my hand out at a staged media event or by accident. The impact of money on this country and political process is terrible. And it's only, as Martin Dyckman was indicating, about our inability to limit spending, because the Supreme Court said he equated it to a limitation on freedom of speech. I might tell you, Martin, that there is a case now, a Vermont case, before the Supreme Court of the United States, in which the court held that it got so bad that literally the money has undermined democracy. And for the first time now, since the Buckley v. Vallejo decision in 1976, the Supreme Court has an opportunity to go ahead and put limits on spending. And if they do, it can have an enormous impact upon who's elected in this country. There ought to be somebody other than millionaires and billionaires running, or people willing to take so much money they literally negotiate away all of their options to handle problems in pursuit of the office and wonder why they can't deal with them afterwards. So there's some hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.